Farzana lived in a small, aging rental apartment tucked between noisy streets and cramped buildings. The paint was peeling, the kitchen tiles cracked, and the faucet always dripped. But it was home, and it was all she could afford. She was in her late 50s, a widow for nearly 2 decades, and worked tirelessly as a school cleaner. Each morning began before sunrise, and each evening ended with aching feet and a tired smile. Her life revolved around her only child, Zishan. Zishan had always been her pride. From the moment he learned to speak, she had whispered dreams into his ears, dreams bigger than their tiny home, dreams of education, law, and respect. She sold her wedding bangles to pay for his school books. She skipped meals so he could have tuition. Every Eid, while others bought clothes and sweets, she quietly wore the same outfit and gave him money, pretending she'd already eaten. For years, she built her life around him like a wall of protection, never asking for thanks, only hoping he'd become a man with a kind heart. But as Zishan grew older, that heart grew cold. He was sharp and intelligent, and the more he succeeded in school, the more he resented where he came from. He'd sigh at their rented walls, wrinkle his nose at the smell of cleaning chemicals clinging to her clothes. One evening, after she brought him tea while he was studying for an important exam, he barely looked up. Instead, he snapped, "Maybe if you owned something in life, I'd respect you." The words didn't land softly. They hit her like a stone. She stood still for a moment, her fingers trembling slightly around the edge of the tray. She said nothing. She only placed the cup down gently, like she was putting down a piece of her heart. Weeks passed. Zishan graduated law school with honors. The university invited family to the ceremony. Farzana wore her cleanest clothes, a faded green camise and neatly pressed shawl. She waited outside the auditorium for hours. When she saw him in his gown and cap, she raised her hand to wave. Zishan glanced at her, then quickly turned away, walking past like she was a stranger. That evening, she received a text. "Next time, don't show up dressed like that. It's embarrassing." She didn't reply. She stared at the message for a long time, then slowly put the phone down. That night, she opened an old wooden trunk under her bed. Inside were Zishan's baby clothes, a tiny white corda, a blue wool cap she'd knitted herself, little booties she once held to her cheek. One by one, she folded them carefully and placed them in a box. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She took out a plain notebook, tore out the first page, and wrote down one sentence in Urdu. "Main khud ke liye kuch banangi." I will build something for myself. And from that quiet moment of pain, something else began to grow. Not anger, not hate, determination. Farzana's transformation began in silence. Without telling anyone, not even her closest friend at the school, she opened a small bank account under her own name at a nearby branch. It wasn't much, but to her it was everything. Every rupee she tucked away felt like a brick in an invisible foundation only she could see. Her salary was modest, yet she found ways to save. A few coins from tea money, a forgotten Eid bonus, the unused gas bill subsidy. She made quiet sacrifices that no one noticed. She stopped buying clothes altogether, even when her old ones grew thin. When colleagues invited her to weddings or community functions, she would smile and say she was busy. In truth, she stayed home to avoid buying gifts or new outfits. She began walking to school instead of taking the bus, hiding from neighbors along the way so no one would think she couldn't afford the fare. Her rented home remained humble, but it became a lab of thrift. She reused plastic containers, stitched worn-out pillowcases into curtains, and learned how to fix dripping taps from YouTube videos at the public library. Her refrigerator broke once, and instead of replacing it, she used a large clay pot setup to keep things cool the old way. Farzana never complained. Each night, she wrote small victories in her notebook. Save 180 rupees today by skipping lunch at school. Reused curtain cloth to cover cushions. Walked 3 kilometers. Saved 40 rupees on rickshaw fare. Months turned into years. And her account, though still small, began to grow, slow, steady, and strong. Then, one day, a sleek black car pulled up outside her gate. Zishan stepped out, now a polished young lawyer in a crisp suit. With him was Neha, his wife, tall, fair-skinned, dressed in a way that said she didn't know the price of flour. Farzana rushed to greet them, her heart quickening with the nervous joy of a mother seeing her son after a long time. But they didn't come inside. They stood beside the car, gazing at the peeling paint and sagging roof. Neha leaned closer to Zishan and whispered, loud enough for Farzana to hear through the cracked kitchen window, "This is where your mother lives?" Zishan chuckled, dismissive and amused. "I told you, she's never owned anything in her life." Farzana stood still, hands soapy in the sink. Her eyes didn't blink. Her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she rinsed her hands, dried them calmly, walked to her room, and pulled out the notebook. She crossed out the old title, Daily Budget, and wrote in bold letters, "For my future home." That night, she made her own tea and sipped it by the window. The stars were out, and the ceiling leaked in one corner. She took a deep breath. No more shame. No more apologies. Weeks later, Zishan called. He wanted a small favor, money to help fund a trip to Europe. Neha had been dreaming of it, he said. It was a professional workshop, but he couldn't afford it right now. His voice was casual, confident. Farzana listened quietly. Then she said, gently but firmly, "No." There was silence on the line. Zishan laughed bitterly. "So what are you saving for? A coffin in that rat hole of a house." She waited a moment, then replied, "No, something stronger than a coffin. A roof that can't be mocked." He scoffed and hung up. Farzana placed the phone down and stared out the window, where the neighbor's child was chasing fireflies. She smiled. The world had laughed at her rented roof. But one day, she knew she'd build a house that stood on more than bricks. It would be built on every sacrifice, every insult, every quiet tear, and every unspoken dream. And no one would take that away from her. Farzana's journey reached its turning point exactly 10 years after she first wrote in that notebook. It happened on a rainy Thursday, when she passed by a quiet lane on the edge of the city, far from the market noise and concrete towers. There, behind a rusting green gate, stood a small house, aged and peeling, but with vines crawling lovingly up its walls and a garden overrun with wild jasmine. She paused. The gate creaked when she touched it, as though it hadn't been opened in years. Inside was a house with cracked windows, faded doors, and a leaky roof. But Farzana didn't see the flaws. She saw sunlight falling across the floor. She saw potential. She saw peace. The real estate agent told her, "It's been empty for 6 years. The owners live abroad. They're asking for full payment up front." Farzana nodded once. The next day, she walked into the bank, handed over her worn but intact passbook, and withdrew the savings of a decade, down to the last rupee. The cashier raised an eyebrow. "You want to withdraw everything?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. She paid the amount in full. No mortgage, no loans, no guarantor. Just 10 years of small sacrifices stacked like bricks into one powerful act of independence. The agent handed her the keys. They were cold and heavy in her palm, but she clutched them like they were alive. Farzana didn't tell Zishan. She didn't even tell her old colleagues. She simply called a neighborhood boy and hired a rickshaw to take her handful of belongings: an old bed, a plastic cabinet, a steel trunk, and 3 pots. On moving day, the sun was kind. Her old landlord stood at the gate of her rented apartment, arms crossed. "You leaving?" he asked with surprise. She smiled, nodded, and said, "Permanently." He raised his brows and scoffed. "Bought a place, have you?" She didn't reply. As the rickshaw pulled away, a few neighborhood kids ran beside it, waving. They didn't know where she was going, but they could feel something had changed. At her new home, the gate resisted at first, as if testing her. She pushed it open, stepped inside, and walked across the garden. The soil was soft beneath her feet. She entered the house slowly, carrying the trunk herself. Inside, it smelled of age and silence. There were no curtains, no fan, no furniture, just bare walls, empty floors, and possibility. She stood in the middle of the living room and whispered to herself, "This house has no furniture, but it has my dignity." Tears welled in her eyes, but not from pain. From arrival. From completion. From reclaiming something life had denied her for too long. News traveled fast. Her former coworkers came with sweets. The shopkeeper from her old street brought her a plant. Children brought hand-picked flowers. An old friend brought her a kettle and some tea leaves. They sat on the floor, drank tea, and laughed in a way she hadn't in years. But the real gift came from across the street. A young woman named Amina, a single mother of two. She introduced herself with warm eyes and nervous energy. "I saw you moving in. If you ever need anything, I live right there." Farzana smiled. "I might ask for help setting up the gas stove." That evening, Amina came over with her kids, little Miriam and cheeky Zaid. They ran through the garden like it was a palace. Within a week, they were visiting every evening. Farzana found herself cooking extra rotis. She sewed Zaid a school bag from old cloth. She taught Miriam how to write Urdu letters with chalk on the wall. The children began calling her Nanny. It made her heart swell. At night, Farzana sat under the dim bulb in her bare room, notebook in hand. She looked at the last page she had written years ago. "For my future home." Underneath it, she wrote, "I have arrived." And for the first time in decades, she slept not in a rented shell, but in a place that finally echoed her soul. It was a quiet Saturday morning. The kind Farzana had come to treasure. The hum of birds in the garden, the soft clink of her teacup, the distant sound of children playing. She was watering the jasmine bush near the gate when she heard the purr of an engine too smooth, too proud for this modest neighborhood. A sleek, charcoal-colored SUV rolled to a stop in front of her house. She blinked, recognizing the license plate. Before she could wipe her hands on her dupatta, the doors opened. Zishan stepped out in designer sunglasses, his shirt neatly tucked, his shoes shining like mirrors. Beside him, Neha adjusted her sunglasses and eyed the house with the kind of expression that mixed curiosity with judgment. Farzana's heart tightened, not with fear, but something older. Familiar. They didn't wait for an invitation. Zishan walked right through the gate and pushed open the front door like he still lived there. Neha followed, looking around the freshly painted walls, the clay vases, the neatly folded floor bedding with embroidered cushions. "Wow," Zishan said, looking around approvingly. "This place is amazing." Neha ran her fingers along a wooden shelf. "Perfect for raising a child." Farzana followed them inside, slowly, placing the watering can by the door. She made tea quietly, her movements smooth and measured. Zishan made himself comfortable on the charpai, his legs crossed, as if the house were already his. "We've been thinking of moving," he said, sipping the tea she handed him. "Neha's pregnant. You didn't know? Anyway, the city's too loud, cramped. This place has such a peaceful vibe. It's perfect." Farzana said nothing. Zishan leaned back and added casually, "I'm sure you'll let us stay here for a while. I mean, it's all in the family." Neha chimed in, "We'll take care of it. You can stay in the smaller room. You don't need much space, do you?" Farzana looked at both of them. Then, with the calm of a woman who had been disrespected in many ways before and survived each one, she replied softly, "This house wasn't built on blood. It was built on silence, and it remembers everything." There was a beat of stillness in the air, sharp, awkward, heavy. Zishan smiled it off. "You're being poetic again, Amy." That evening, they left, but not before Zishan took a slow walk through every room, even the small storeroom, examining things as if mentally measuring his future. The next morning, Farzana went to her kitchen drawer to retrieve her property documents. They were gone. Panic didn't rise. Instead, a chilling clarity settled over her. She turned to the tiny security camera her neighbor's son had helped install near the front door. A quick review on her old phone showed it all. Zishan slipping the documents into his briefcase while she was in the backyard washing the dishes. Her breath caught, but not from surprise. It was confirmation. A few hours later, she received a message. "Don't worry. I'll take care of the papers. You can trust your son. No emojis. No apologies. Just quiet threat wrapped in false comfort." Farzana stared at the message. She didn't reply. Instead, she changed into her simplest clothes, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and took a rickshaw to a law office in the city. It was the same building Zishan had once interned in, but she didn't go to his firm. She went to Mr. Idris, a retired legal advisor she had once cleaned offices for, who had once said to her, "You're the most decent person in this whole building." He greeted her with surprise and warmth. When she told him what had happened, he didn't dismiss her. He listened closely, and when she handed him the security footage, he sat up straighter. "This is serious," he said. "He's trying to commit deed fraud. But don't worry. With this footage and your payment records, we can protect your ownership." Farzana's face remained calm, but her hands, knotted in her lap, relaxed just a little. As she left the office, she passed a large banner on the road that read in bold Urdu, "Justice delayed is justice denied." She whispered under her breath, "But justice doesn't forget." The days that followed were filled with silent strength. Farzana made no mention of Zishan's betrayal to anyone in the neighborhood. She still watered her jasmine, still helped Amina with the children, still sat each morning in her garden sipping chai. But behind the scenes, she was quietly building the strongest defense of her life. Mr. Idris, her lawyer and old schoolmate, worked swiftly. They filed a formal complaint with the property registrar's office and attached the security footage of Zishan stealing the papers. He helped Farzana get a notarized affidavit with every detail of the purchase, including stamped receipts from the bank and statement from the previous owner. There was no room for doubt. She had paid in full, legally and ethically. "Don't worry," Idris said one afternoon, pouring her a cup of strong tea. "We'll file our counterpetition by tomorrow." He tried to manipulate the system quietly, but will respond loudly. And legally, Zishan, meanwhile, had submitted a sly civil petition at the local court, requesting a family-based transfer of property on compassionate grounds. In his paperwork, he claimed Farzana had gifted the house to him verbally, and he was simply formalizing it. It was a common trick, hard to prove false unless the truth was backed by evidence. But this time, Farzana had the truth, and a camera. As her lawyer prepared the paperwork, she remained silent. No confrontations, no warning calls to Zishan. She knew better now. Some battles weren't won by arguing. They were won by waiting for the right knock on the right door. Then, on a golden-orange Thursday afternoon, Zishan returned. He didn't knock, of course. He never did. He entered her house with his usual smugness and placed himself on the sofa like he owned the place already. His polished shoes tapped on her new tile floor. Farzana was in the kitchen preparing lentils. She didn't look up. Zishan took a deep breath and said, "Your home is about to be mine. You should pack before the court order arrives." She wiped her hands slowly and walked to the living room. Her face was unreadable, her voice calm. "Court won't come," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" She continued, still quiet. "But someone else will." She stepped out the door and stood on the porch, folding her arms and staring at the horizon where the sun was dipping lower. Zishan stood up to follow her. But before he could reach the door, the first flicker of red and blue lights swept across the garden. They weren't loud at first, just a quiet warning hum. Then came the siren. A police vehicle rolled slowly into view and parked in front of the house. Neha, who was waiting in the car, sat up straight, confused. An officer stepped out, approached the driver's window, and tapped gently. Zishan rushed out. "Officer? What's going on?" The officer looked at his clipboard, then at Zishan. "Zishan Ahmad?" "Yes. We have a warrant. Step out of the vehicle. This is regarding an ongoing investigation into forged property documents and the unlawful possession of legal records." "What? Are you serious?" "I'm her son." The officer didn't flinch. "You stole from your own mother," he said firmly. "That's not family. That's felony." Neha looked away, mortified. Farzana remained on the porch. She didn't move. She didn't shout or cry or speak. Only her eyes shimmered, not with pain, not with hatred, but with quiet relief. The kind that comes when you no longer have to prove you were right, because justice arrives wearing a badge. As Zishan was led away, his eyes met hers. He didn't see the mother who used to pack his lunch or the woman who skipped meals for his tuition. He saw someone stronger. He saw a woman who had built a home, not just of bricks, but of boundaries. And this time, the door closed behind him, not to shut him out, but to finally shut out the past. News of Zishan's arrest spread fast. By the following week, his face was on local news channels. Not for a courtroom victory, but for an ongoing criminal investigation involving property fraud against his own mother. The legal fraternity whispered. Colleagues distanced themselves. His name, once tied to ambition and promise, now became synonymous with betrayal. He was released on bail after 3 nights in a holding cell, but the damage was irreversible. His law firm terminated his contract without hesitation. The Bar Council initiated a formal suspension of his license pending the outcome of the case. Clients withdrew their trust, and so did Neha. She didn't announce it. She didn't fight. She simply packed her things one morning and left a folded note on the bedside table. You don't just lose a case when you lie. You lose everything. Zishan was left alone in a rented flat, far smaller than the one he mocked years ago. As the trial moved forward, Farzana never stepped foot in the courtroom. She never testified, never appeared for questioning. She trusted her lawyer, and she trusted the truth. Mr. Idris submitted the evidence, video footage, signed receipts, and a timeline so solid it left no room for Zishan's manipulation. The judge didn't even need long to consider the case. Reporters waited outside her gate, cameras in hand. Amy, just one comment. How do you feel about your son being exposed in court? She looked at them, offered them a cup of tea, then said simply, let my silence speak louder than his shame. And with that, she returned to her jasmine plants, her morning routine, her peace. But something had changed inside her. She felt the urge to pass on what she'd learned, not through revenge, but through restoration. She cleared out the extra room in her house, painted the walls pale yellow, and bought a few shelves. Slowly, she turned it into a tiny neighborhood reading space. One mat, a few secondhand books, and a blackboard. Children began arriving after school, drawn by her warm smile and her bowls of roasted chickpeas. She read to them, taught them small lessons, how to write their name with pride, how to speak kindly, how to listen when others speak. She told them stories, not of kings and monsters, but of resilience and quiet strength. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, a curious little girl named Eliza tugged her sleeve and asked softly, "Is this your only home, Auntie?" Farzana looked around at the books, the cushions, the soft hum of children's voices in the background. Then she placed her hand gently on Eliza's head and replied, "No, child, I build another one, inside myself, where no one can steal the peace." And in that quiet moment, her legacy began. Not in courts, not in headlines, but in hearts. The sky was a soft blend of amber and rose as the sun melted into the horizon beyond the garden wall. The jasmine vines swayed in the evening breeze, their scent lingering like a quiet hymn. Farzana sat on her old wooden rocking chair, the one a neighbor had gifted her the day she moved in. A shawl wrapped gently around her shoulders, and in her lap rested a book she wasn't really reading. The porch was still, peaceful, a kind of stillness that took years to earn. Then she heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not hurried, not confident, just slow, tired steps, heavy with weight that had nothing to do with years. She looked up. Zishan stood at the edge of her garden, older now, hair slightly unkempt, his once proud shoulders slightly hunched. He looked at her as if asking a silent question. She said nothing, just watched. He approached slowly, almost unsure if he was welcome. When he reached the porch, he paused. Then, without a word, he sat down beside her on the second chair, the one that had always been there, always empty. Silence passed between them. Not angry, not forgiving, just real. The rocking chair creaked beneath her. The birds had gone quiet. After a long moment, Zishan spoke, his voice rough and low. "I came to say I'm sorry. I was proud, cruel, blind." Farzana turned her face toward him, her expression soft but unwavering. "You weren't blind," she said quietly. "You just refused to see who raised you." He nodded slowly, the truth heavy in his throat. Tears pooled at the edges of his eyes and fell, without sobs, without theatrics. Just honest, tired tears. "I don't want the house anymore," he said through the quiet. Farzana looked away, her eyes on the horizon now. "That's good," she said calmly, "because it never wanted you." There was a pause. Then she added, after a long breath, "But I still have a porch, and sometimes it welcomes lost things." Zishan turned his face toward her, surprised. She didn't meet his eyes, didn't offer a hug or a hand. But she didn't ask him to leave either. And that was something. They sat like that for a while, mother and son, two people separated by pride and pain, joined again by something more silent, regret, perhaps, or grace. The light dimmed. A breeze passed. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. And as the last glow of sun dipped behind the jasmine wall, the old rocking chair creaked again. This time, not with loneliness, but with presence.